Hi, everyone. My name is Niko. I'm the founder of Tor. Thank you so much for tuning in today and having watched this pre-recorded session. We're now going into the live Q&A. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. I personally left with many questions answered, but also with many follow-up questions as well. So we're really thrilled that Professor Yuval Noah Harari joins us now for a live Q&A. Have a look at the chat window on your right. You can ask your questions in there. There's already 20 plus questions there. You can also upvote the questions that we're giving. We have 20 minutes for the live Q&A, so keep the questions coming. And now please have a warm welcome for Professor Yuval Noah Harari.
Hello.
Good to see you again, Yuval. Thank you so much for joining in. So like I mentioned in our backstage chat, we have lots of questions, so we want to dive really right into it. One warm-up question of mine. I recently traveled to the United States, and I actually went to my first conference again, and even to my first concert. And it struck me that it really seemed as if post-COVID could look like pre-COVID, at least on the surface. You once said that emergencies like COVID fast forward historical processes. So what kind of world will we inhabit once the storm passes?
Well, it depends on the choices we make. I don't think it's inevitable. I mean, some things are accelerating and changing at really a frightening rate. If you see the process of digitalization and the way in which the big digital giants are kind of eating up the economy in the world, this is really breathtaking. Other things change at a much slower rate. If you think about, basic human nature, we still like to socialize, we still like to meet people in person and hug and kiss, the same way that AIDS didn't kill sex, so COVID is unlikely to kill hugging. So it's all a question of what you're looking at.
So we start with the first questions now from the audience. I will read the questions out loud to you, just in the order that I received them from my colleague Celia. So we start with a question from Marius. Do you have the impression that in an increasingly complicated world, a growing nostalgic feeling in human society is happening, which may cause for the fear of innovation?
Well, people were always nostalgic. They always thought that there was some golden age in the past that they want to go back to. As a historian, I know it's not true. I mean, the past wasn't fun. Even if you could, you wouldn't really like to go back there. But it's really a question about politics. I mean, what kind of fantasies do you sell people? And basically, there are two kinds of fantasies that politicians are selling people. You have the utopian futuristic fantasies that with this technology will solve all the problems, will make the world perfect. And then you have the nostalgic fantasy that will go back to some perfect golden age. And both are equally dangerous. I mean, we have to be realistic. We can't go back to the past, and we shouldn't, because it wasn't good. And technology it's not going to solve everything. You can use the same technology to create heaven or hell. The really difficult part is not the creation of the technology. It's reaching a social consensus about what to do with it.
Question from Christoph. Do you think the trend of a money-focused society to a value-focused society, for example, with the sustainability trend, especially among millennials that we see, will that continue? And how will the world be 50 years from now when this actually succeeds?
Well, I don't know how the world will be 50 years from now. I keep saying that I'm not a prophet. I don't know. I can map different possibilities, but in the end, it depends on the choices we make. So there isn't like a single future that is going to come no matter what. Now, about money value and about money-driven society and value-driven, I think ideally we should combine the two. Money is just the most common system of evaluating things. The problem is not money versus values. It's that very often money doesn't really reflect the true value of things because it doesn't include externalities. It doesn't include many other things. So I'm not in favor of like completely rejecting the money economy. I think it should actually be more inclusive if it really, if the money value we give things would really reflect all the values that are important to us, that would be a much bigger improvement. And then the ecological sphere is the most obvious example. If you can put a money value on the damage that pollution is causing, that will be a tremendous improvement in the way that we treat the ecosystem.
Next question from Richard, and at least in my experience looking at my nieces, somewhat related to Gen Z. Just because it's written in a book doesn't mean it's true. How do we teach people to critically assess the information they're presented on modern media, such as Facebook, Twitter, and all other social media channels?
It takes time, but it happens with every new technology. The book was also once a new technology, and people believed anything they read in a book just because it was in a book. And even you have entire religions built around this new technology, the book. We don't think about it, but a book is a technology. For thousands, tens of thousands of years, there were no books. You had religions, but no religions of the book. When books came along, then you had these technological fanatics who have all put all their trust in the new technology, the book, and think that just because it's written in the book, that's the truth. And over time, what happens is that people create trust institutions that have this ability to judge what's true and what's not true, whether it's in a book, whether it's in a radio show, whether it's in Facebook. The key is not the technology, but the creation of this new kind of institution of trust. So newspapers are an example, and the entire scientific community is another example. And every time a new technology comes along, it destroys the old system, including the old institutions of trust. So you have a period of confusion when you don't know what to trust, but then gradually a new institution of trust emerges. And that's the process that we are going through right now. And it will happen with things like, deep fakes, that, we learned that just because something is written on a piece of paper doesn't mean it's true. The question is, who wrote it? Which institution gives us the kind of guarantee that, yes, I checked it, this is true. So now we have to do the same thing with audio and video and with deep fakes, that now we just don't know what to trust. But gradually we learn to trust certain institutions that tell us, yes, this video clip is authentic, the others are not.
So good follow-up question on this topic by Susa, who writes, why are stories so important now? And if it was true what you've been saying in our conversation, that people need stories regardless whether they're true or not, why are fake news so popular now? Or if I can, maybe slip a follow-up in there here, is it just technology that basically spreads them faster, or has our relationship actually to fake news changed in a post-truth world?
Well, as a historian, I'm very skeptical of these claims. I think fake news were always around. They were always very popular. Yes, new technology creates new ways to disseminate them. But the phenomenon itself is as old as humanity. Fake news thousands of years ago or a century ago were often much worse than they are today. If you think about, for example, the witch hunts in the 16th and 17th century, that's fake news. And yes, you don't have Twitter, you don't have Facebook, but you have either the village gossips, or you have these printed pamphlet and books that tell you about witches. And if you go back a century ago to the early 20th century, so you look at the huge propaganda machines of regimes like the Nazi regime or like the Soviet regime, the technology today is different, of course, but everything that the peddlers of fake news today know has already been discovered by people like Goebbels. Goebbels' famous saying was that you tell a lie once, it remains a lie. You tell a lie 1,000 times, it becomes the truth. That was well known in the 1920s and 1930s. So actually, I think that the situation today is significantly better than it was a century ago or in the Middle Ages. It's still bad, but there is some kind of progress there, because it's also much easier and faster to refute the fake news stories going around. If you live in some small medieval town and you hear these stories about witches, you don't have anywhere else to go to compare these fake news with and reach some kind of personal decision about what's true and what's not. Mm-hmm. Now, at least in many cases, you have alternative sources of information that you can compare.
Bob asks, if history tells us that the truth rarely unites people, what causes people to unite, both historically and he's asking also neurologically?
Well, basically it's stories that unite people, not the truth. The stories can be more true or less true, but this is not the key thing. Very often the truth is at a disadvantage because truthful stories tend to be more complicated and sometimes also more painful. We often don't want to acknowledge the truth. So anyway, the stories can be sometimes ridiculous, nonsensical, and still they can unite millions and hundreds of millions of people around them. I'm not implying that this is all bad. We need stories to unite people. Even if you think about something like playing a game of football or baseball or basketball, everybody needs to agree on the rules, even though the rules are just fictional creations of our own minds. The yardstick to ask is, who is suffering from the story in which I believe? And then go and listen to the stories of the people who suffer from your story, and then reevaluate your story. But the fantasy is that we can create a human society without any stories at all. It never happened before in history, and it's unlikely to happen now. Maybe a society of aliens or AI robots or something could function on a different basis, but not Homo sapiens.
From Elisa, are humans prepared to understand, accept, and exchange economic growth, ROE, for other models of growth, such as return on equality, return on environment, return on engagement and collaboration?
Mm-hmm. The question is whether humans will.
Are we ready? Yeah, are we prepared? Are we ready? Will it happen? Will we rethink these metrics and models?
I don't know. In principle, we can try. I mean, the story of economic growth, again, it's just a story. It wasn't there all the time. People in the Middle Ages did not believe in economic growth. They didn't think it was possible. Kings didn't promise that if I'm your king, I will provide you with economic growth. For thousands of years, it was not a central idea that motivated people and shaped society. It became extremely important in the last few centuries, and today it's probably the most common story in the world, irrespective of religion or political ideology, whether it's China or the US, whether it's a Muslim country or a secular country, everybody wants economic growth. But once we realize that, this is just a certain story we created, or some people created, we can try to think in a different way. And I don't know if it will work. It's extremely, what we need to realize is that changing a major story always takes time. You cannot just destroy the whole world and create a completely new world in one step. Again, that's the kind of dangerous fantasy that I talked about earlier. Every time it has been tried in human history to create a completely new society from scratch, the results were not so good. So change is possible, but changing a really major story, it's easier to play with the story and tinker with it than to completely replace it in a single step.
Mm-hmm. From Sorab, a question on the educational system. I'm sure a lot of parents who have taught their children over the pandemic had similar questions. So the current educational system doesn't successfully test if a person is able to reason, think critically or rationally. How can we change the system so that common people don't lose trust in science?
We need to focus less on explaining the findings of the scientific community, of the scientific method, and more on understanding how science actually works. It's less about remembering the equation or the names of the, kings and battles in the past, and it's more about understanding how did people reach this equation. How did people know the history of events 1,000 or 2,000 years ago? The more you understand how the system actually works, I think at least most people will gain more trust in it, because what's really impressive about the scientific system compared to other systems like religions and ideologies is the very high level of internal disagreement that it is willing to tolerate, that it even encourages people. That the basic thing is that to really advance in science, to get your PhD, to get a professorship, to win a Nobel Prize, you need very often to contradict previous common views. You don't get a Nobel Prize for saying the same thing that everybody said before you. You need to really revolutionize it, to go against it's a system that there is a built-in very strong mechanism encouraging people to disprove the current dominant theory. And when you realize it, that this is how the system works, you understand. You have it like sometimes, the theory of evolution or virology, how viruses work. If you could disprove these theories, you would get like the Nobel Prize in whatever, medicine. And there is an enormous incentive for the smartest people in the world to disprove it and show something else. And if they haven't managed to do it, then that's a very strong reason to believe that the theory is sound.
And we are 3 minutes to the end, Yuval. So maybe we'll go sort of for a rapid fire question session.
Okay.
You've done a great job in our last conversation of answering them shortly. Camilla asks, as you said, Yuval, that science will not give us the answer for ethical questions. What is the role of arts and humanities in this? Do we need more of it in times of automation?
Yes, it's extremely important, because what automation and science does at present, they make the philosophical and ethical questions more important and more urgent than ever before without answering them. So all kinds of philosophical arguments that have been going on for thousands of years, now they become practical questions of engineering. So we can't wait another 1,000 years for the answer. So there is a greater need for the contribution of the humanities and arts than in any previous time in history.
Sasha writes, where do we draw the line between fear of innovation and rational doubt? For example, when a new product is developed, waiting for more studies on potential downsides, side effects, etc.
I think it's a case by case situation. It depends on if you have a global epidemic with millions of people in danger of dying and the global economy collapsing, and you have a vaccine, but it's still in an experimental stage, that's a different situation than if there is some, rare condition which is not even life-threatening, and you have this new experimental drug that might or might not work. So, I don't think that there is a one rule for all these cases.
From Zoe, many places feel like the pandemic is over, while in others it's surging, like in India, for example. What can we collectively do to help in those places? What are some of the learnings and maybe most impactful things that can be done?
Well, the most important thing is to have a global cooperation on this, especially in the production and distribution of vaccines and other necessary medical supplies. It should be obvious to everyone in whichever country you live that as long as this pandemic keeps spreading anywhere around the world, nobody is safe. I'm in Israel. We have one of the highest rates of vaccination in the world, and life is roughly almost back to normal. But if we don't contribute to other people, to other countries, and this continues to spread in India or Brazil or wherever, the danger is that there will be a mutation, a new variant, and it will come back in an even worse form, and we'll have it again. So it's a global problem. It can only be solved through global cooperation, and we shouldn't let any country be left behind.
3 last short questions, and then we're done. One on ambiguity. You actually said that in the future we will need to be able to deal with much more ambiguity.
Yeah.
But from a neurological perspective, that could lead to fear and anxiety. So how do we prepare our brains and our children for what lies ahead?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I mean, part of the thing is that we'll need to keep learning more and more things, and also keep forgetting more and more things. If you think about, racial and gender issues today, so you have people in their 70s who are still running countries and corporations, and they were born in the 1950s. They still carry the brain baggage from the 1950s. And part of the thing is, you need not just to learn a lot of new stuff, you also need to unlearn a lot of stuff and to forget a lot of stuff. And I'm not a brain scientist, but that's a wonderful question about how the brain works. That how can we keep learning when we are 50, 60, 70, 80? And even more importantly, how can we unlearn and forget things that in our 50s and 60s and 70s? And I'm not sure about the answer, but it's going to be extremely important to survive the roller coaster of the coming decades.
2 last questions, one more on the heavy side, and then we'll end on a lighter note.
Okay.
From Anonymous, why do you think that humans want to be immortal? When we learn so much sorrow and war and misery from history, why does man try to see things happen?
I think most people can't grasp what immortality actually means. To live indefinitely for billions of years without being able to die, we can't really grasp it. What people really have in mind is a much simpler question. Do you want to live another 10 years in good health? Almost everybody says yes. And at the end of these 10 years, do you want to live another 10 years in good health? Again, almost everybody says yes. So this is the kind of immortality fantasies that people have. They don't really think, what would it mean to be 2 billion years old? That doesn't make sense to us.
And last question from our dear Karen. Is there anything that makes you hopeful that society will overcome the rifts growing through disinformation and polarizing narratives, especially around science?
I think the world is more unified than in any previous time in history. which is also why we see the rifts more clearly. But, when the Black Death spread around the world in the 14th century, there was no common conception of what's happening. Everybody had their own theory. The Chinese, the Indians, the Arabs, the Europeans, the Greeks, everybody had their own theory, and they were all wrong, of course. It's punishment from God, it's some astrological phenomenon, it's, it's black magic, lots of theories, all wrong. Now, when you have COVID spreading, yes, you have all the conspiracy theories and whatever, but in almost all countries, the medical establishment and much of the political establishment is united in a single explanation. This is a virus. This is how the virus spreads. This is how we can stop the virus. And this is how we can produce a vaccine and solve this. And it's the Chinese accepted, the Japanese accepted, the Indians, the Americans, the Germans. Yes, you have, again, these conspiracy theories and so forth. But broadly speaking, it's the first time in human history that there is a global agreement on what is a disease and how to deal with it. And it's the same in many other fields, from physics to sports. If you think about, I don't know if there'll be an Olympics in the end in Tokyo or not, but it's amazing to think that people from all the world can come together in one place and agree on the same rules for sports contests and games. 1,000 years ago, this was absolutely impossible, not just because you didn't have the transport to bring people from all over. They didn't even know that America existed, and the people in America didn't know that Asia existed. But even if you can somehow get everybody in the same place, they wouldn't be able to agree on the rules for the different games or how to divide the athletes. Like, we have an agreement that you divide them by nationality. So you have these national teams. Try to do it 1,000 years ago, it's absolutely impossible. So, and this is my perspective as a long-term historian. I'm a medievalist originally. Before I started doing all these things with cyborgs and AI, I specialized in medieval European history. So almost anything people tell me about what's happening now, I have this comfortable feeling, yes, it's bad, but in the Middle Ages, it was so much worse. So I'm not saying it in order to make people, what's the word? Feel too comfortable, like smug and, okay, there are no problems, nothing needs to be done. Complacent, that's the word. No, it's just the opposite. It means we need to be more responsible. If you look at history, the long term of history, not a few years, if you look at centuries and you don't see any improvement, then this implies that maybe the laws of nature are in some way against us, that improvement is impossible. If you see the same level of violence, the same level of disease, the same level of hatred and bigotry for century after century without any change, then just give it up and go do something fun, because it probably can't be changed. But when you look at the long term of history and you see that some things are really improving, that our ability to overcome diseases is really improving. I mean, a century ago, 1/3 of children died before reaching adulthood from either infectious diseases or famine. Now, all over the world, it's less than 5%. That's a huge improvement. If you look at the amazing achievements of the feminist revolution in gaining more equality between genders, that's an amazing achievement. And that means we should be more responsible, because it proves that it is possible to improve things. So if things are not improving, or if things are even deteriorating, you can't blame the laws of nature. We need to look to ourselves and see, what are we doing wrong? How come in the last 40 years we've seen these reductions in violence and suddenly it's going up again? We are doing something wrong. That's the kind of responsible message of this way of thinking.
Yuval, thank you so much. We could do this for hours. At least I could, and I think we would have enough questions. I hope we will welcome you to Berlin maybe sometime in the future to continue
I
this
hope so very
conversation.
much.
But for now, I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge, your insights, and your time with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, Yuval. Bye-bye. So before we get into the expo area where you can ask some questions to me, I'll be there. Tough act to follow from Yuval around Tor and our future and our changes that we've done as an organization. Let me please take some time to thank everybody involved in making this conversation happen with Mayim Bialik, with Yuval, and now the Q&A that we had today. So first and foremost, of course, I want to thank everybody who has been watching, who has been tuning in. Thanks to the community showing up and asking so many thoughtful questions. Many thanks also to Yuval Harari, of course, to Mayim Bialik for sharing their time and insights with us. Thanks to Leaps, the impact investment arm of Bayer, with Karen, Andre, Jürgen, and everybody else in the team. I want to thank the whole Optimist crew who helped produce the event and the recording. My team at Tor with Celia, Daniela, Elise, and Katja taking the lead here. So thank you for everybody. And I will now go into the expo area for a Q&A, and you can ask me anything that you have in mind about Tor, our new virtual initiatives, Tor Club, and everything else. Thank you very much.